And we're back in our segment on grief care with David Kennedy. So David, as I have been working here at Shepherd Village for in the long-term care, there's about 60% approximately population has been diagnosed with dementia or Alzheimer's. And the families are experiencing grief a little differently. And I think there's a term that you were using about ambiguous loss. Could you walk us through that, what it means and what kind of grief they might be dealing with?
So again, and I'm so glad that we had these first sessions to build up to this, because I want to make this distinction between ambiguous loss and grief. So the ambiguous loss is not the grief. It leads to grief, and it's certain types of grief. But it's this loss that does, in fact, bring grief with it. And it's a term, ambiguous loss is a term that's been around since the 1970s. A therapist, Pauline Boss was her name, lived in the States, and she was doing her graduate studies and in sociology, actually, at that time. And she was doing research with families, and she noticed the challenge in families where fathers were absent, either physically absent, or they came to the sessions, but they didn't participate. So she actually developed that idea, and she moved on in her research to look at Vietnam vets and the coming back from war. Eventually, what she designed was this term she called ambiguous loss. And there are two ways in which ambiguous loss happens. The first way is when a person is physically absent, but psychologically present. So what that would look like is if, and looking at our military side, soldiers who their body was never recovered. They were killed in battle, but they didn't know what happened to them. Or people were lost at sea and they couldn't recover bodies. And you can expand that to people who, parents who have a child who maybe is on the streets and drug addicted, and they don't know where their child is. So any term where there's the body is not present, but they're present physically, they're absent. Psychologically, they're always there. I have had in my counseling in Peterborough specifically dealt with 2 homicides where the bodies were not recovered. They were the people responsible were put in prison, but they refused to say where their victim was. So here this family is living knowing that their mother, in both cases, is dead, but they don't have a physical body to bury. So that's one side of ambiguous loss, where they're present in your heart psychologically, but they're not physical. The other way that ambiguous loss works is when people are physically present, but psychologically absent. So this is where we would look at things like dementia and Alzheimer's, where people will say, as you hear all the time, it's just not my mom anymore. My mom's gone. This is not who she was. This is not my dad. My dad was, I know they're here physically, but they're not here in a way that we can have conversations or talk about memories or do any of those things. The relationship that I had with them is no longer there. So they are physically present, but psychologically absent. And both of those scenarios create what Pauline Boss called ambiguous loss. And so it's important for us to recognize that loss, which is, and that number of families you said, which is extraordinary, those people are experiencing ambiguous loss, which leads to a type of grief or certain aspects of grief as a result of that. So that the two things we need to pay attention to is first of all, how do I work with ambiguous loss? How do I help myself in this situation? And what's really fascinating, and I'd be interested in your comments on this, is that my experience shows that family members try to make the person more like they are. They try to get the person back. They want the person to be more who they were, when that's just not possible.
Yeah, so
So
there's
the frustration,
yes,
the frustration that happens.
that initial phase of when they first come into realization that my mother or my father has diagnosis, with after they've dealt with the shock, the tendency is to maintain them
Right.
as long as they can.
Exactly.
So correcting them and saying, oh no, today is this day and you're mixing this up, mom, or I am not your husband, I'm your son.
Right.
And making sure those corrections are made, and that really frustrates that moment and presence that they can have with their family members.
And that's so it's great, and you see that every day. And I've certainly witnessed that in my profession and in a personal context. So people are, we have to learn to deal with this ambiguous loss, where a person is physically present but psychologically absent, and people try to do that, as you say, by trying to keep things the way they were.
For as long as they can.
As long as they can.
Yeah.
And I understand that, and I understand why we want to do that. But it usually ends up in frustration, and it doesn't matter, because they won't remember 2 minutes from now anyways. So we are the ones that walk away frustrated, and we have perhaps created upset. And it also makes it challenging to want to come back. Like visiting is hard. If every time I visit I end up in this frustration. So I think paying attention to this ambiguous loss. So let's give it a term and say to people, this is what it is. This is why what you're experiencing. And it will lead to certain types of grief. And I'll talk about those in our next segment probably. But this ambiguous loss, we have to learn how to deal with this. We have to learn. And we do that not with the person, we do that with ourselves. How do I have to deal with this in a way that allows us to be together in a good way? And the first step of that is to acknowledge and to call it. I think it's helpful to say, okay, this is what it is. This is, I have an ambiguous loss here. My mom, my dad, my grandpa, my grandparents, they're here physically, but they don't have the mental cognitive capacity or the relational pieces that allow me to connect in that way.
There are a lot of people that have labeled this as saying the long goodbye, because it feels like you had in our previous segments talked about a few examples where a mother felt she didn't have enough time to say goodbye, but dementia and Alzheimer's in particular feels like this is a long goodbye, because every day you're losing a little piece of that mom, dad, wife, spouse. And it's painful, and I don't think that we do put a label on that grief. So we don't know that we are in the middle of that grief.
So the way in which I think we approach the ambiguous loss for family members is to recognize that what we are working with is not the relationship pieces. What we're working with is ourselves. So I stress that this is a stress-based approach. So, and I look at the term resilience. What it takes to do this long term is resilience, not for that person, but for me. How do I build resilience, and what is resilience? Resilience is the ability to deal with the situation as it is in this moment without being overwhelmed. It's the ability to draw resources that I need in order, and I'll use the word cope, to cope with what it is I'm experiencing. And how do I build resilience? How do I develop that within myself? And there are some ways in which we do that. But it really does mean the family has to be willing to adjust to the situation the way it is. And that can sometimes be quite quick, or sometimes it gets protracted. So you're right, the initial shock where the most adjustment has to come takes some time. But what we are wanting them to do is to learn how to build the resilience and stress pieces in themselves that allow them to come without having the expectations of what this meeting is going to be like, right? That can be helpful. So saying to a family member, I don't know what's going to happen today. They may be talking about whatever. They may not know you, whatever. But whatever it is, it is. And I'm willing to, rather than correct them to try to get their information right, I want to try to just be with them in a way that allows us to be together. But that's hard for me because it hurts. It hurts to see my parent like that when I know who they were. So again, we're kind of caught up in this relational piece. And that's the grief side. But the loss side is the ability to say, can I build resilience in myself and the stress pieces that allow me to do this well?
So David, you know, in our previous segments, we talked about mourning and grief. And if we take it from the example of discussing a grief about death, so there is a death happened, it's an event that happened, and then there is a mourning that starts from that event. In ambiguous loss, it's harder to define those, those clear cut lines. So where does the mourning piece come into that?
So the mourning is the grief. So what we're mourning is the grief that comes out of this loss. So let's.
So what does it look like?
So it looks like. So it can be sometimes a disenfranchised grief. So other people will say, well, you're not grieving because your parent's still living. Well, no, I'm grieving the loss of my parent the way they were. And people don't realize that. So you don't get the support the same that you would. I mean, if your parent died, then, the neighbors would come, they'd bring food, you get all that. But if your parent gets diagnosed with Alzheimer's, you don't get the support the same way. I mean, people will say, oh, I'm really sorry, but they don't surround you with support the way you would if the person had died. So it's a disenfranchised grief. So now you are dealing with it and the grief you have, and people don't realize it. So how do you mourn that, right? How do you express that? So I've encouraged people to find what is a way that you could and I'm going to change the word mourning to honoring. How do I honor this person the way they are now, not the way they were?
That's beautiful.
How do I honor who they are now? And sometimes we have to look hard.
So David, that's interesting. Honoring instead of mourning. Share a bit more.
Well, it changes, I think it does a lot of things to scene. It changes our approach to it so that it's not about me, it's about the person I love. So how do I honor them? And the way we may not want to, I realize and recognize that when people, as they age, and particularly with dementia and Alzheimer's, it can affect their physical appearance in ways that, that person, if they were cognitive, probably wouldn't appreciate that being out there. So I don't necessarily think that just having a picture of them up is the best answer. I want to honor them in a way that respects them as well. So I may take a symbol. So I often say to people, all right, what 5 items would you put on that table that would explain what your mom means to you now? What are 5 items that you would choose that would say to you, these reflect some aspect of who my mom is now that still I value? And then take one of those items and then put it somewhere prominent for a week. Carry it with you if you can. Bring it out. If people say, oh, what's that? You say, oh, that's my honoring thing for Mom this week. And she still smiles every time I come in the room. She doesn't know who I am, but she still smiles. And I love her smile. What else do we honor about her or him? And so and sometimes people have to think. I don't put people on the spot. I say, I want you to go away and think about it. Next time you visit there, you think about it. You look for it. What is it I can still honor in that situation in the moment? And then find a way to represent that. So ritual is taking something common and investing it with uncommon meaning. So it might be, it simply might be a coffee cup or a teacup, because every time you go, your mom wants tea. And you honor that. You say, well, you have a teacup out. So it's just a teacup, but it's a teacup that you've invested meaning into. And that's honoring the situation. So that's one practical way.
It makes me think of what you had been saying earlier about how grief changes us, and it's living with that transition.
Right.
But here we're doing it with someone who is alive, but we're grieving the person that we knew at, but there's a change in that relationship now, and so you're transitioning with it as we
And they're still here.
And they're still here.
You can say, and I know people say to me, they're not here, they're just their body. But my point is that we are all known by our bodies. Our body is part of who we are. It's the part that ages. It's the part we see aging. But it's the way in which we know each other. I mean, I think of my mom's hands. It's funny. My wife says to me, "You got your mom's hands," and there's pieces physically that we carry that are genetic, right? So our physical pieces are important. And yes, their spirit may be different. Their cognition is not there the way it was, but they're still physically with us. And so this ambiguous loss is part of it that leads to a grief, but we can honor that grief by honoring the situation we're in now.
We as a society don't know how to embrace aging.
No, we don't.
And I think this just adds a compounded effect on it.
So we'll talk more about that in the next.
All right, David, thank you so much for sharing all your wisdom.